Today I'm going to be showing you how to make this 17th or 18th century inspired pirate shirt. Last weekend I went to a Renaissance fair and I saw a lot of these poofy pirate shirts and I really wanted to buy one, but I didn't. One, because I spent all of my money on instruments, and two, because none of them really fit my kind of weird proportions. And so when I got home, I decided to make my own. And through watching a few videos and a lot of hand sewing, because I didn't want to use my sewing machine, I was able to make this shirt. And today I'm going to be teaching you how to do the same. For this one, I just used some cotton, but for this one that I'm going to be making in this video, I'm going to be using this blue linen and viscose blend. And I didn't actually know what viscose was, so before buying this I looked it up. And viscose is also known as rayon, and I don't know why, but for my entire life I thought rayon was plastic, because it just sounds like plastic. Rayon sounds like polyester or spandex or all these other plastic types of synthetic fabric, but it's actually not. It's made from wood pulp, and it's a very sustainable, like, alternative in comparison to polyester or even cotton. And I was kind of shocked by that. I'm not sure how good for the environment it is because of toxic chemicals that they use in its creation process, but it's still a natural fiber technically, and that's what I'm going to be using for this pirate shirt today. For making this, you're going to need some form of measuring out your fabric, something to cut your fabric with, a needle and thread, and probably some buttons. You can also use punch like eyelets or grommets, which I would recommend, because that'll help you if you want to lace this up, but you can also button this up if you want to. The video that I learned how to do this from is a video by Pins and Weevils, which I'll link down in the description below. And there's videos going to be a bit more in-depth and more on historical accuracy and how people would have done it in the 18th century, whereas this is just a quicker tutorial on how I did it. First we're going to want to measure out our pieces, and I'm going to start with the torso piece. So I want to put the measuring tape about halfway up halfway across my shoulder. I'm going to measure down to about partway down my thigh. That's about 31 inches. Next I'm going to measure around my chest. I don't really need this measurement to be super tight or accurate because I want this thing to be very baggy and billowy. So I'm going to very loosely measure around my torso, leaving a good amount of space. That's about 46 inches. Next up, I'm actually going to measure and cut out my torso piece. So since I had my length at 31 inches, I'm going to measure down to 31. I'm going to mark right there. And I'm going to want to fold this over along that marking so I have double that for both my front and my back. So now that I have this folded over itself, it's doubled up so that this will make the front and back side, making unfolded this whole thing about 63 inches, or 62 inches. And then I'm going to take my torso measurement and I'm going to half it because front and back sides, and that's about 23 inches. I'm going to mark right around 23 mark. Then I'm going to mark all the way down to the bottom of this piece. Next I'm going to cut along that line and along where these two intersect. So I'm going to sew along these two sides to make the shirt-like body. However, I don't want to sew up where my sleeves are going to be, so I'm going to measure down about 10-ish inches so that I can start sewing here so that I leave a hole for my sleeves. And for you, you might want to do 10 inches, you might want to do more, you might want to do less. It's sort of more up to you. So for this one, I hand-stitched everything, but because we're filming and that adds like 2 hours to any creation process, and I didn't have anything else to do when I was making this one, I'm going to be using the sewing machine because it'll go a lot faster, and I'm not super fast with my hand stitching. Yeah. You might notice I didn't stitch all the way down on this one. That's because I want to have these two little flaps so that this doesn't limit my mobility. Next I'm going to want to cut out my neck and head hole. So I'm going to fold this over like that so I can make sure that I get this in the middle. I'm I'm going to cut just a tiny little snip like that. And that allows me to get my scissors into the fabric so that I can cut a little bit in each direction. From that center point, I'm going to measure out about 4 inches in each direction. And I'm going to measure about 3 inches or 4 inches down. Then I'm going to use that center hole that I cut to cut along this top fold to each one. Now you don't have to do this, you can just leave it square, but I like to sort of bevel my neck hole or like lace part down a bit. Next I'm going to flip the whole thing inside out so it hides those seams on the inside, because that's how it will be when we're done. And I'm going to try it on just to make sure everything fits properly and everything is working. So just from that, I think I'm going to make the neck hole or the line here a little bit longer, and maybe increase the length of these as well so that it allows my head to fit through a little bit easier. Because of the kind of awkward shape of this neck hole, I'm actually going to be using a needle and thread to hem this part by hand, just using a bunch of whip stitches. Now that I've got the neck hole and the collar sewn up and hemmed over, I'm now going to move on to making these sleeves. So I already said that I'm going to have the width of the sleeve be about 10 inches from one side, so about 20 inches around. But now I want to measure the length, and to do that I'm going to do my best Spider-Man impression on this and pull it to about my shoulder length, which is about 27 inches. So that's how long I'm going to make my sleeve. So it's going to be 27 inches by 20 inches. So I've measured this out to 20 inches this way, and this is 29 across, so I can just measure out to 27. I'm going to put a mark right there for my width, and trying to line this up as square as possible, I can put a mark at 27, which is about right there, for that way. And then using this template, I can fold this over. So now I've got both of my sleeves cut out, and now I'm just going to fold them over themselves like this, and I'm going to sew along that line. You might also notice I left about 4 inches of unsewn area on the sleeve. That's to account for this little opening for my cuff, so that it can still bind tightly to my hand with my hand still fitting through when I want to put it on. And now I just need to hem that area over. Yeah, I think I can something like that. So to sew on the sleeve, I'm going to take my sleeve and I'm going to flip it so that it is how we're going to want it at the end, with the stitch hidden on the inside like that. And then I'm going to take this part that I want to be my end or my cuff. I'm going to put this into the inside out torso or body of it. I can kind of pull this through the collar here, so that these two pieces line up like this. And I want to get this stitch and this stitch to line up. Then get the rest of this to line up fairly flush and straight. And then I'm going to use the sewing machine to sew along this whole circumference. So now that I've got that all stitched around, I can pull this sleeve out, and now everything is inside out, meaning once I flip this all around, everything will be outside, or correct side out. So now this is with the sleeves sewn on, it's a fully functional shirt, but now we have to add the more piratey details to it. So first, I'm going to flip it so that it's the right way out. Then I'm going to show you how to make the very iconic frilly cuffs with all of that stitching. So now to get that like frilliness, I'm just going to put a running stitch throughout all of this and just kind of bunch this up and put a stitch in those little bunches. Now you can measure this out so that's like every centimeter or every millimeter and have a very exact way of doing this, but I just kind of eyeball it to see if it's the right length away. And you want to do this on the farthest point, or fairly far away from the base of your cuff so that you have room. Now that I've got both of these done, it's time to work on the actual cuff part. Okay, for the actual cuffs, for measurements, I want about 10.5 inches long by 4 inches wide. Then I'm going to fold it over like that so that I can cut two at the same time. Put this up so it doesn't fall off the end of my table. So now I want to sew my cuff onto here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at one of these higher peaks on this like folded over frilly bit. I'm going to pull that through, then I'm going to put it not right on the edge, but leave myself a little bit of room to hem and have for a button, and poke through right there. Then I'm just going to continue kind of whip stitching through these taller peaks and then through my collar material, or cuff material. And it looks very messy right now, but it will get better in a second once it's starting to get on. And you don't have to sew through every single one, but the more you sew through, the stronger and more long-lasting your shirt will be. So next I'm going to fold this over and stitch it along there again in basically the same way. Now that I've got both of these cuffs sewn on and I also hemmed the edges on here, now I'm just going to take some of these little buttons, I'm going to put one here and then cut an eye hole on this side. And last but not least, I'm going to put the grommets onto this and put some lace through it. I've now got all of the grommets on and the button fully sewed on with the buttonhole. I've also got my lacing, which this is just leather sewing thread that I've tripled over a few times so that it is a little bit more thick and substantial. And that's it. Thank you again to Pins and Weevils for the tutorial that I kind of based this video off of. And thank you for watching, and as always, have fun. So, making these pirate shirts took me about 3 tries before I got one that works well, and even this one has a few minor flaws, but it's better than my first one. This one was the first one that I sewed, and this one works perfectly fine. It is a shirt, and it works, but I'm afraid that if I wash it, all of the stitches will come out and it'll kind of fall apart. One of the things that I could do better for all of these shirts, besides this one and this one, is hem everything over. This one I did whip stitches for, but I would still want to hem this over, because if I wash this or if it's just through a lot of rough patches, it will fray and kind of fall apart. Also, for the sleeves, I stitched them by hand over each little bump in the fabric, and that works, but if you're going to do that, again, hem it over before you do that, because it didn't work for this one that I actually did wash and it fell apart. This is the one that I made in this video, and it sort of fell apart when I washed it. And to fix that, I just sewed along it like that instead of hand stitching it over each bump, and just ran it through the sewing machine, and it worked a lot better, it was a lot faster, and it just is a lot stronger generally. The other thing that I did to make a lot of these seams and stitches more strong is I folded some of them over, but for a lot of them I just did a sort of serging stitch, or a stitch that went over it a lot of times to kind of bind it in there. But this one specifically I did also fold over, which makes it a lot stronger as well. And I would recommend doing that for almost all of your stitches. That's what I did on this one. All of these are folded over and serging stitched, and it works significantly better, and I think this one will hold up a lot more. Another thing that I've learned while making this is you don't need to cut holes for your grommets usually. If you're using one piece of fabric, really thin fabric, don't cut holes before putting the grommets on. Just put the grommet around the fabric and hammer it through, and it'll punch out the fabric in the perfect hole just by itself. I sadly learned that on the very end of grommeting this one, so there are a few spots where I made the hole too big, and I kind of had to sew the grommet onto it so that it wouldn't keep tearing open.